So we're going to start our, the lecture series in developer productivity, and our first speaker is Can George Bomakis, who was also scheduled to give a talk at 9:12, but he couldn't. So it's a good way to get started. Thanks, man.
Yep, it works. Is that too loud or just right? Okay, great. Well, thanks for your time, and I'm pleased to be here and talk about test issues. People in test are not program managers, so I may not make for the most engaging presentation or the most engaging presenter, but the facts are what matters most, so bear with my presentation style. So what I thought I'd do today first is to talk about a few things. Oh, I forgot the clever little animation. I'm so sorry. I cheated you. You want to go back and see that again? So I thought we would talk a little bit about some context, because I think any discussion of test engineering means including some education about what testing is all about. I think of the core product disciplines, it is probably the one discipline that is least broadly understood outside of people that are actually in that discipline or who have worked in that discipline at some point in their careers. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the product cycle, technology and product shifts that we've experienced in the last few years, and some what-if scenarios. And then talk a little bit more about key concerns and the things that I would like you to take away as kind of thought fodder. In particular, my bent will be very office-centric, because since I came to Microsoft 5.5 years ago, that's where I have been. So this won't be to ignore issues that NT or Visual Studio or Exchange or the IE team have that are both common to all test teams and in some cases specific to those test teams. But I think that at least 80% of what we feel challenged with in Office test are germane issues to almost all product groups at Microsoft, especially as our interdependencies between product groups increases over time. So some useful context. One of our measures in the past has always been, and this is not an industry standard, in fact it's worse than the rest of the industry in my career experience, is a 1-to-1 dev to test ratio. Now that has been a working assumption for many years and a good model at Microsoft. Unfortunately, as product complexity has grown, one of the things that we find is that the correlation between the unit of work a developer can create and the echo effect on a tester is not 1-to-1 correlated in all cases. Many times it is, but many times it is not. But that is how we think of the ratio between dev to test. That in many cases, HP used to be one of the leaders in this arena, where they could tout that they had a 3-to-1 ratio of dev to test, and they thought that was fantastic. And most, in the late 70s and early 80s, most operating system companies, not application companies, but operating system and hardware vendors, thought that a 5 or 6-to-1 ratio between developers and test was appropriate. And the level of test engineering sophistication has grown dramatically since then. The tool set has grown dramatically, but then, of course, the bar for product complexity has raised as well. So Microsoft is a little bit unique in the thinking of the world as a 1-to-1 ratio. And to my knowledge, the application areas of IBM and Corel and many of the other smaller application companies, who, whether they work on Office X Suites or not, do not maintain a 1-to-1 ratio. We never have enough automation, ever. And part of that is rooted in the fact that automation is difficult. It's time-consuming to create. It's huge leverage for the individual contributor test engineer once it's created. But we are always pushing to raise the bar on the quantity of automation that we have and the amount of code that automation covers, and making sure that it's the right automation. To a degree, some other context is that our temp costs are sometimes masked by the fact our test costs are sometimes masked by the fact that we use temps heavily. And we've had other things going on in the company where we're looking at being smarter about how we use temp resources. But test engineering in particular is one area where we have used a lot of temp resources, more than program management and more than development historically. DLL hell, I'm sure you're all familiar with this issue and its many faces. This is another huge challenge that kind of permeates everything we do in test engineering and in product delivery in general, independent of the test discipline. And lastly, our growing configuration coverage matrix. That is not getting smaller. It is only getting larger.
When you said 1-to-1, is that 1-to-1 full-time, or like, one developer, one tester, being a 3 tests, or
It depends on the team. The objective is a 1-to-1 full-time ratio. Some teams have 1.4 to 1 when you include their temps. Some teams have 0.8 to 1 when you don't include their temps. And so there's a little bit of variation there between teams. The ideal or the objective balance and what we budget towards is getting a 1-to-1 ratio of full-time heads. So a little bit about the Office product cycle, and this is going to be very high level, and I want to give you just a little bit of a test bent, what testers are doing in the timetable of getting a product out. The very first step we take in Office is what we call the vision phase. And the vision phase simply means we're sitting down thinking about what compelling scenarios and tasks we want to enable for our users with the next release of the product, what competitive issues we want to address, what past errors and past problems we want to correct that we shipped in the last version, although early on we don't often understand those completely yet. At that point in the cycle, before we have a good development schedule and a good set of initial specs, test is usually still engaged driving the past release postmortem, finishing up, getting out the rest of the SKUs after the core US release is done, understanding the discussions around new features for the next release, and thinking about the implications for those in terms of test planning, test tool requirements, etc., and then speccing and developing any necessary tools. Sometimes we look to kind of global tools team like Aaron's team for tools help, but more often than not, and this is just as true for Office as other teams, some of our test challenges will require tools that are unique and help solve a unique problem within our particular product group, and so we tend to grow those at home. Then we come on the early milestones in the development schedule, where developers have a schedule in place. We have some of the initial specs written. We go through a process in Office called spec inspection that we started about 3 years ago, where the program managers actually have to convene the relevant peer discipline members into a room who will be working on that feature and get them to actually sign on the dotted line that that spec is done. Usually there's an initial meeting where they go through all the bugs in the spec, and then a follow-up meeting once it's cleaned up and ready to go. And for a spec to actually be useful and to develop plans around, we call that spec being in an inspected and signed off state. It's not clear to me how many other product groups actually manage it that way, but that's what we do in Office. But in the milestones, in Office 10, for example, we're right now in the final 2 weeks of Milestone 1 integration. This is when some of the earliest feature testing takes place. This is when we work the kinks out in the build, test, release cycle and get the whole machinery working again, since it's kind of sat, since we shipped the last, not sat as passive, but decayed is more of the point, since we shipped the last full product release, in this case being the final releases of Office 2000. We also kind of review and reprioritize what's in the test arsenal, and that's not only the tool set, but how much auto test collateral we have. In Office 10, for example, a couple of our application teams were woefully behind in the amount of code coverage they could achieve through their auto tests, and they've been going gangbusters trying to catch up with other teams who have much higher code coverage. We can get into code coverage specifics later if you'd like. We get our early test plans designed, test design specs, the test schedule. We kind of round up our dependencies and try to get our arms around all the risks that we think will face us in testing. And we also contribute to shaping the milestone criteria and what we think the exit steps are, that exit criteria for each distinct milestone in the schedule that helps test make sure that the product is as stable as possible as we go from milestone 1 to milestone 2 to code complete to beta 1 to beta 2 to RTM. And then we test the milestone-specific features that are getting implemented as deeply as the health of the code allows us to. Code complete and stabilization. So this is at the end of the cycle, and what we do at Code Complete is pretty much try to get the patient back up off the surgery table and running around the track again. In Office 2000, we had 3 discrete feature implementation milestones. In Office 10, we have 2. So that means that the source tree, as a patient, has undergone some pretty major surgery, and at the end we spend like 6 weeks, which is what we're wrapping up now for Milestone 1 in Office 10, going through recovery and make sure that she can get up and run around the track again before she goes back on the table for the next wave of feature implementation. And Code Complete marks for us where the dev schedule has every item checked off. Every scheduled chunk of feature implementation has been done. Specs are completely solid and frozen and done. And we move into a point in time where we're going to primarily work on stabilizing the product and getting the bits out for the earliest chunk of feedback. And testers at this point are working feverishly to not only deal with feature issues, but also making sure that those bits can be externalized, that it can be installed on a user's machine, that it can be removed cleanly, etc. One of the things I pushed for hard in Office 2000, and I think we did a real good job of, was having what we called an alpha release, or you could call it a beta 0 release, which meant to work towards Code Complete to make sure that the product was so stable we could get it out to 200 people off campus. And we're doing that again in Office 10. Because one of the things that every product group at Microsoft deals with is the tension between getting the product to a stable state comes so late in the product cycle that by the time you can start to get real feedback, it's too late to make significant changes. And so we know who our friends and family are that have been productive beta sites in past releases. And we have a couple of forums like the Office Advisory Council who we engage early on our feature design. And so test teams are very focused towards finding and pushing development to fix the bugs that will allow us to have the product in a state where the new features we can get the best feedback on at the earliest possible opportunity. And for us, that's at Code Complete. We're also completing our new automation. We get to a point in the test cycle where we have to stop spending time investing in new automation because that is laborious, and have to shift more and more of our attention into ad hoc bug finding. And that may be scripted, or that may have a manual script or not, but it's not developing the automation scripts, because at a certain point between Code Complete and Beta 1, your automation should be working for you, so that with the rich set of configurations that have to be covered, no matter how narrowly you have equivalence class that set of configurations to cover down to, the automation should be your asset and helping you get all kinds of runs in that you couldn't do yourself as an individual human being. So we have to kind of get automation off our plate at a certain point. That's why we try to attack it early. And after we get past Code Complete and before the first broad technical beta, which is Beta 1, we have Beta 0, 1, and 2, we're also trying to expand the test scope to get onto other configurations, other locales that we may not have tested in the past, largely because the problems were so egregious that it didn't make sense to expand our scope and our coverage until we had more stability. During the beta cycle, we further complete our feature testing and stabilization. We push our automation coverage bar to the goals that we set, and we start listening very carefully to the beta feedback, looking for, and it's not needle in a haystack, but it's looking for very few gems in a sea of stuff that we get back from our beta users. Happily, the two trends, at least for Office, that we have seen is that our beta bugs that are reported to us are largely bugs we already knew about. Not completely, but largely. And our post-ship bugs are largely bugs we didn't know about. Not bugs that we postponed or were a victim of, an erroneous victim of triage, but largely things that we did not catch. And it's a problem either way, right? You could say your post-ship bugs, if you postpone them, well, then your triage process was wrong. But if you didn't know about them, then your overall testing cycle was wrong because you didn't find them, right? And then we also push the bar to get more and more dog fooding within our divisions across campus, and finally get to the last stage of the bug discovery cycle where, well, depending on how you're looking at the chart, the find rate starts going down dramatically, but the size of the gems you're finding in those last few weeks are pretty significant. And so while the find rate is down, the bugs that you find in the last 8 weeks, many of them are victims of triage, and we decided it's not appropriate to fix the bug, but we find some real doozies. And at least in Office, we think that we have a pretty predictable model for how long it takes to get the product from the second technical beta release to RTM. And you can say if that's already in our heads, then it becomes self-fulfilling, but we try very hard to beat that every time, and it still ends up taking pretty much the same amount of time. And one of the other steps, too, that we start working on, besides buddy testing, people swapping off areas to test, is pushing more and more to get scenarios tested, to think about the scenarios that an individual is using or going to execute across the applications in the suite. Because it isn't just about getting the Excel features working or the Word features working. It's about actually accomplishing a task using the Office suite and making sure that any last-minute feature discoverability issues or navigation issues or usability issues are discovered by having a scenario focus. And that the ability to do that really, and the bandwidth and test teams to do that, comes very late in the cycle generally. So internal shifts in the Office group in the last let's say 2 or 3 years, let's say the last couple product releases, a significant shift towards shared code. When I joined Microsoft in '94, the only thing that really glued the Office suite together was a common setup program. Otherwise, it was individual apps in a box. And that made sense at the time. Each of those groups that now make up the Office suite had been independently very successful in their markets, and the focus was very much on word processing or spreadsheets or data and databases and data access, etc. But what our users were telling us is they wanted more integration. And one of the mechanisms to achieve that was the advent of having shared code. This also helped us with many features at the UI level get consistency and more consistent discoverability of features in place across our applications. Because when people wanted to use drawing tools, for example, they wanted those to work the same in PowerPoint as they did in Word. So Worldwide XE is another thing that we've tried a couple of releases on, both for Office 97 and Office 2000. Typically, product groups here at Microsoft have a delta. The U.S. release, being the largest market, goes out first, and then the localized releases come off on some delta schedule afterwards. We came relatively close in 97. We came very close in 2000. And for Office 10, this is a goal again. And what this means to test teams is that there's a lot more parallelism that they are responsible for in testing, not just for international sufficiency support within the applications, but actually testing in other locales besides English on an ongoing basis and early in the cycle. And that's actually pretty daunting for most test engineers. LPK, the language pat kit, this was our provision in a SKU of the string DLLs that it takes to shift and a little applet that lets you shift the language on the fly. So you can go from English Office to German Office without having to reinstall. But from a test engineering standpoint, it's another intersection on the matrix of what has to get covered. So this has added another layer of complexity to what we have to test. Temp versus full-time resources, we're moving more and more towards recognizing that some of our costs really are hidden in how we use temp resources and institutionalizing some of those roles into full-time positions. And we're still in the process of doing that. Lack of sameness across SKU-bound teams. Boy, how many people would understand what that meant if they didn't work at Microsoft? So what that means is all the applications that are in the box have done things differently. They've done things differently in the UI. They've done things differently with their code architecture. They've done things differently with their development or build process. And as inventing shared code didn't share all the sameness woes across the applications in Office. And where the buck usually stops for lack of sameness is with test teams, where we find that things cannot be tested together because teams are doing things differently. In Office 10, we now have one thing that's helped us a lot is one single team responsible for what we call the pipe, the build, test, release cycle. And this has greatly improved some of the sameness issues in just getting testable bits from the developers to the appropriate testers in the same team. And more cross-team feature integration is another shift in the last few years. And again, DLL hell has just gotten worse. I think I have that 3 times in the slide, so it must be important. External shifts, our market success. We've been incredibly successful as a division. The Office product is somewhat of a standard. It is pervasive. I mean, I can remember when I first came to Microsoft, not only did I kind of want to be humble, but when I would talk to friends and family, I would say, well, do you use Word or do you use, even I kind of just expect most people are using Word now. So we've been incredibly successful, but that also means the range of things that we have to do to keep our customers satisfied has expanded just as much. Dan?
How much effort is in quick fixes US teams for large enterprise customers? Does Office have to do a lot of those?
We do. I mentioned that on a later slide. We have formalized that now into a full-time team headed by Jean Sheldon, who used to be the Word test manager. So she has a small development team, test team, and program management team whose title, MOS, Microsoft Office Sustaining Engineering, that is their full-time gig. And the number of hot fixes has gone up significantly. Our desire to provide better customer satisfaction has gone up significantly. And if you take a look at the content going into the first service release for Office 2000, in terms of the number of actual fixes, that's gone up significantly from the same service release for Office 97. Yep. Extended product support life. We are supporting more operating system and browser and Office version combinatorics than we ever have before. and the last bullet there, which I just answered for you. And that's just as true for NT and at least one other product group that I can think of to formalize this. So somewhat of scenarios. There's a ton of these. And, test engineers, I think, are known to be perfectionist, persnickety types. And I think that part of what we've experienced in Office is that the scale of what we do has increased significantly. And what we want to see happen as test engineers is that we get testable bits on a regular, somewhat predictable basis with the fewest interruptions, because every churn of the crank, output from development to test, and as fast as we can churn that reliably, so much more productive is each individual test engineer. And we have a lot of metrics by which we see how test engineers are productive. We look at code coverage. We look at the bug find rate. We look at the find to fix ratio of those bugs being found, how many are actually resulting in changes to the code. We look at the ratio of dupes. We look at the other things that test engineers have to do that isn't bug finding to pull the product together. But one of the things that is the core currency to make test engineers productive is to get testable bits into their hands as frequently as possible. I've never had a test engineer come up to me and say, I'm getting too many new builds. Never had that happen. I would love to see that happen. So what if, when a developer makes his code change, he syncs, and he does a private build, prior to check-in, he had a way of identifying the potential performance impact of that change. He had a way to identify what autotests of the autotest collateral that exists he could actually run to pre-flight beyond just his check-in tests. Yes? Mm-hmm. Oh, performance pigs are being birthed all over the cycle during the milestone phases. Absolutely. Now, to our advantage in Office 97, we had the first office-wide performance benchmarking lab. We had some real execution issues, and the development teams often didn't, sometimes for good reason, sometimes not, believe the data. In Office 2000, we went so far as to order these boxes with motherboards whose serial number was off by one from the next to have the most closely related machines possible that were absolutely identical in the lab on its private network, made a huge tool investment, and got to the point where developers could not question the data. So by God. And that made a huge difference in how early we actually attacked the problems. And now in Office 10, we've had benchmark results now for a couple of months. We're also in the process of making a shift to our automation tool set, which has clouded the delivery of that a little bit, but we're catching up now. And it's the earliest point in the cycle we've ever had good performance data for developers to look at and see where the performance issues are.
For the various builds that you do you have something where part of the build before check-in, they do run a suite of automated tests to do some of the...
We do. It's only been in the last couple releases where we've gotten the development teams to agree that sending check-in mail is a requirement and that running check-in tests prior to actually shoving the bits into the SLM tree is a requirement. And some teams kind of gravitated towards those requirements early and some kind of lagged. And even today there's still some inconsistencies, but it's much, much better than it used to be. What we don't have today, and there are ways that we could do this using the IDF output from using Lego, to actually take a look at the autotest tree and say, you know what, my code change is going to touch the following stuff. Here's a bunch of autotests I could potentially run. I probably should do this, because check-in tests are small. They're, make sure Word boots, right? They're of that ilk, right? And some groups have more in their check-in tests than others. But one of the factors for developers with check-in tests is also the time that it takes to run them, not just the coverage. So they try to gate the coverage in a check-in test, and we do with build verification tests as well, by not just looking at what code it covers, but how long it actually takes to run that, because there's only 24 hours in a day. So there's two factors at play there. Localization impact. Wouldn't it be great to be able to have an environment in which you could know that before you even checked in, and to be able to communicate directly to the test owners that are impacted by a given change? Because it may not just be, in this world of increasingly shared code, your peer tester. It could also be 2 or 3 testers in other teams who are impacted by the change you're about to make, especially if it's shared code. During the build itself, check and test BVT logs could be richer. We could have better automation of how that logging takes place and better notification mechanisms. Now, we have a new thing in place for Office 10 where the entire build process is broken out into a set of steps that you can subscribe to get notification about pass or failure at any one of those steps. And when we first got this in place, of course, being a tester, I said, oh, great, I'm going to sign up for everything. Wow, more data than I knew how to even parse. And so I've gone back and said, okay, these are really the key things I want to kind of keep track of. But then I like to look kind of at everything. Now, an individual tester just probably wants to know what's going on in her or his area. This has made a big improvement from notification before when we really didn't have anything in place there except like pink sheets on build failures and email getting sent. But it still could be better, and it still could be tied together tighter. And component setup requirements. This is also something that is still hard for us, so that when code gets checked in for the first time, you actually know, is there a setup implication in this? And if so, how is that getting communicated other than word of mouth between individuals actually working on the feature area? If the build production of the localized builds was completely automated, if the highest priority auto test collateral got auto executed on a regular basis, where you go in and you take a look at your automation tree and you say, you know what, these are the things this week or this month or this milestone we care about the most, and we're going to prioritize those to run at every opportunity they can on a regular basis. No different in a way than what we do with our performance benchmarking, where we say there's some key scenarios that are most important, then a second wave, and then a third wave, and their execution is, the periodicity of that execution is based on that priority. Where change of...
What drives your priorities on the auto tests?
It would be where the code changes are currently taking place and what code is getting touched by the features currently getting implemented.
Rather than keeping track of which ones have been failing more frequently?
Well, that too. One other inconsistency we have across teams and office is that different teams push to get to 100% auto test complete earlier than others. Word, for example, generally gets there first more than other teams. And I won't go into who's usually last, but change, to the degree that change impact could be captured and channeled correctly and quickly, this goes back to the other issue of just not in check-in notification, but even before check-in, when we have features getting implemented and the developers thinking, never code from scratch. You're always getting this code into extant legacy code. If we had a better way for developers to actually scope the likely impact of the change, because seeing the feature in the spec as opposed to sitting down and actually trying to implement it in extant code is a very different thing. When they get to that step, if we had a better way for them to do risk assessment and communicate with their tester what's going on. Now, part of this is just a human thing, but part of this might also be a tool issue. Instrumented version data. We have a human connection there between getting the IV data and actually channeling it into our optimization scenarios. I'd like to see a better connection there that was less human dependent. Not completely automated, because you would have bad decisions taking place, because it has to be interpreted and we have to make the right call, because the way people are using the product and how we want to optimize the product is not always completely correlated. But today, IV data, on the one hand, comes late into the cycle, and it requires much more human involvement to figure out how it relates to our optimization scenarios than I think it should. And the build tools, RAID, and our source control as a knowledge management solution, these things are not well hooked together today. There's perhaps a schema issue there on the one hand, but more to the point, you have human interfaces between these things. And at one level, you need those humans for interpretation of what decision to make, but when you're trying to get your arms around the state of the product, you have to go to many, many different places to figure out where the bug trends are, where the build breaks are, what's going on with the source tree and the kinds of changes being made to figure out where the product is at any point in time. It's just not tied very tightly together. So another way of saying this is what matters the most. The tightest possible loop between dev change and test impact is what many of the things that I've talked about are about. The fastest possible build turnaround and throughput. developers aren't dumb. They have a hard job. They have an incredibly hard job trying to get features implemented in a product without breaking them, without breaking the product, and to communicate change effectively to their testers and to their program managers. It's really tough. It's painful for a developer to check in today. And although Office is a large product, I don't think this problem is unique to Office. The highest...
What's the current build turnaround typically for Office?
I'll put a positive spin on that. In Office 2000, during Milestone 1, which we're just at the end of now for Office 10, we had a point in time where we were getting builds out every 10 to 14 days. It was abysmal. Part of that was how the different teams who contributed to the build were organized. It had to do with our tools. It had to do with a bunch of stuff. In Office 10 now, we're at the point where we've hardly ever gone more than a week without a build. And in many cases, it's been 2 builds a week. We shoot to do a self-host build, which has a slightly higher quality bar than a self-test build, and it's much improved. So on average, given our experience in Office 10 so far, it's still early, I would say that we have a build out every 3 days on average. And we've been in this milestone since July, August.
And what's the reason that you can't do it quicker than that?
It's a large code base. It requires humans to respond to build breaks or check and test failures. The human who has to respond is likely off doing something else. They're not just sitting, waiting around for something to go wrong. The notification mechanisms, I think, are better, but they're still not as good as they could be. Late in the cycle, typically people with, you have a point person each team, they wear a pager, etc. We don't do that early in the cycle. I don't know if that's the right solution either. And it's a large code base, in case I didn't mention that already. It's a large code base. We do, yeah. Yep. But our architecture in Office is a little different than NT. I know one of the things that they're looking at is doing even further distribution of the build from its current state. And our interdependencies are much more spaghetti-like than NT's. You can't build and optimize and drop an increment of the MSO DLL, for example, in isolation from other components. Well, you could, but you'd stand a high chance of breaking things.
If you had clean source that you previously built, how long would it take to build it again?
Just the pure build time with no changes? Gosh, I think it's like under 2 hours. This probably would not include running the optimization scripts, which is fine. I mean, that's, that part's actually fine. So I think 2 hours would probably be the fastest turnaround. So I think we have all the right machine horsepower to it, and the distribution of the actual build functions across that horsepower. Highest level stability of the throughout the product cycle, of course, is key too. And a tool set that allows better automation and distribution of the test burden. One of the things that we've achieved by the investment in automation is that more people can run other people's auto tests, but that often doesn't happen as much as it should, because those other people are busy with their own stuff. And this also is an issue outside of Office. As NT works on a given service pack, for example, I would love it if NT could run all of Office's automation as one of the acceptance criteria for the drop of a service pack. But they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that. And even if they did, and there were some false failures that end up being an NT issue rather than an Office issue, you'd still end up engaging the Office test engineer to look at the log, to interpret what the bug was, just to find out that it's an NT issue, not an Office issue. And then you start really having a constraint with people's bandwidth and time. We do some of it today, but it's still tough. Knowledge in the product cycle. We have state-of-the-art tools and approach, but we really don't have a hooked-together DNS or knowledge management solution, for lack of a better expression. I think it's getting there. One of the examples of that is the HTTP Office 10 system I'll talk about in a little bit. But the places where this integration could be better is for automated test creation, management, and distribution with our manual test case management solutions, with our defect tracking system, with our customer beta and post-ship feedback mechanisms, with code change and build management, the pipe in other words, and with the way that we actually articulate and capture feature validation scenarios. I think a schema is part of the issue, but it's not the only issue. There's also the issue of the tools to drive this. So some test challenges and thought fodder. There's a lot of cultural issues, too, with making the product development cycle better. Software development is an art, but it's also having to become more and more of a science, because we've been incredibly successful as a division in Office, incredibly successful as a company, and more of it, as our scale increases, I think of it as this needs to be a better manufacturing operation. Now that probably sounds terrible to a lot of people, but that is very much what we're in the business of doing. And to note that some of the communication requirements that we have achieved between disciplines are only recent breakthroughs, I think talks a lot to the cultural issues that we face across disciplines and across teams. And this is by no means a unique issue to Office. Knowledge management in general. Often this stuff is driven by tests, because test engineers have this other job, and that's actually being a project manager, for lack of a better word. The buck stops with testing. Program management's real busy in the first phase. Development kind of starts in and test, and we try to get everybody started earlier so they're scoping out what the risk and change set is. But in the final analysis, program management towards the end of the cycle is off thinking about, as they need to, the next release. Development is responding to whatever bugs are hitting the radar, and test is scrambling to make sure that the product is a whole product, and then all the P's and Q's have been minded. And that often involves a great deal of project management in addition to actual test authoring and bug discovery. HTTP Office 10 is a website that we've developed. Bill G saw this during our Office 10 Milestone 1 feature reviews with him. He thought this was the greatest thing. And it is a pretty cool thing. I don't think any other product group has done something like this. But it's essentially just a huge website. And we're using a lot of Office technology and active server pages to represent, on-demand bug data, build information, etc., one-stop shopping. And this was a huge post-mortem issue for us. People wanted a one-stop place to go to find out the state of the product. But each of those views is still coming out of different sources that aren't connected, and at least they're centralized in one place we can kind of go get things, but it's not perfect. And product parts and owners, that's another thing. We have to do a survey every time. Okay, we've reorged. Who owns this code now? What developer, what tester, what program manager? Oops, there's no owner? Well, that's a problem. Or this person owns too much? That's a problem. Or this person is owned by a TBH? That's a problem. I mean, this code is owned by TBH. And our legacy support is made more difficult by the fact that we have to go back and rediscover old decisions and support old methods. We don't capture a lot of that stuff very easily. Some of the critical decisions that affect the next product are captured between the last technical beta release and RTM, when we're going through a huge, what's called a war room or box-wide triage. Some very critical decisions are made there, and that stuff doesn't get captured very well, so that people can go back and say, well, why did we do this? Why did we not fix this bug? Or why did we fix it this way? And I think that in some areas we don't have the best tools in ownership, and I see this as really a company-wide problem, and this affects test a lot. Political correctness stuff. We've got the GPS website and a team and an effort led by Tom Edwards, and they're working very, very hard, but I think that they're having a challenge engaging people. And if you talk about some of the heartache of getting Office 2000 at the door, including in my chest personally, some of the last-minute issues were very much GPS issues that were affecting us in the last couple of weeks of ship, because we couldn't even get an agreement in the company on terms, and we couldn't ship a problem, but we couldn't get agreement on whether it was a problem. Our localization tools, it's getting much better. Global political sensitivity, I'm sorry. And there's a website for this. You've not heard of it? Okay. Okay, yeah, that's okay. These are things like how you refer to the Republic of China, or the Republic of Taiwan when it's a Chinese product. It has to do with date formats that are acceptable or not. It has to do with, we've had problems in terms to look up clip art, and a certain term will bring up a clip art image that suggests this term is being used in an idiomatic way that's not politically correct. All kinds of things like that. Our localization tools is getting better. It's still not as good as it could be. And, of course, security, which is a problem that affects all product groups at Microsoft.
Is there a separate security testing team or separate?
There is not. It's a cross-functional team. It's currently headed up by a test engineer who did this for Office 2000, and he has point people. A lot of issues we drive this way. He has point people in each application or shared code test team, and they meet on a regular basis, more frequently based on where we are in the product cycle. And we solve a lot of cross-team issues that way. It also is a great leadership opportunity for people to grow into, to drive these kinds of things. Humans fill the gap. And often the human factor falls to testing because we're the last stop before the code gets out the door. And in general, when it comes to tools, this is something I think that we've always struggled with because most of the tools challenges are either development tools or test tools. And I would probably say more than 50% of them are test tools. RAID has been a great success story. There's a knowledge management system, actually, is RAID, because that's actually how we use it today. And we extract from the RAID data more than just kind of this week's stuff, but we look for the trends, etc. I personally don't think we do enough analysis, causal analysis on bugs using RAID data. And in fact, to support causal analysis, there are some things that RAID would probably have to do differently, and we would have to use it differently throughout the course of the product cycle. But that said, that's been a great success, and LEGO's been a great success because we've been able to leverage that numerous different ways, including in the test end of the spectrum. But other key tools that each team has are homegrown, and this includes our test distribution systems and some of our UI test automation systems. In particular, for Office, we've had great success with a tool called Oasis, the Office Automation System, which is our distribution system, and with Test Wizard, which is what we developed to replace Visual Test, which used to be MS Test. And those have been great, but they're homegrown. Other groups don't use those. And these kinds of differences often make it more complicated for different product groups to share each other's auto test collateral. The build process significantly improved in 10, but not fast or stable enough yet. And this is a company-wide issue. Everybody's facing this. Better automation is needed for various HTML versions to support, for staying backward compatible, and for browser testing as a host. Automation within the browser, IE does have a little bit of an object model, but not a whole lot. And increasingly, that's where Office collateral that the user produces is viewed. At least if our user base is moving in the direction that we want them to in terms of intranet authoring and publishing, that will increasingly become common, and we don't have as much support there as we'd like to see for testing in the browser. Incorporating our prioritized test matrix into our execution methods. This goes back to the configuration nightmare. With every release, we have to think about every operating system service pack, browser version, and often system DLL or shared code versions, and the configurations of those that make the most sense for us to test on. Historically, most testers have either had a Windows 95 or 98 machine and another machine with NT4 and the latest service pack, and they probably only test in admin mode, not user mode. And we're working very hard to do something that's a little bit Big Brother-ish, which is to kind of track the configurations people are testing on, to see how they install those machines, and to give them a better set of tools to create those diverse configurations in the first place before they install the latest build of Office. And the pieces aren't all pulled together yet, but this is something we have to do earlier because there is not enough diversity across our test teams in those configurations. More easily instantiatable real-world test configurations. So the other dimension of this, too, is even if we improve that at the core operating system browser shared system DLL level, you can't fake time. And a typical user using Office has a machine that's gone through Windows 95, that's gone through Windows 98, that's gone through Office 95, upgraded to 97, upgraded to 97 SR1. Then they did some admin mode and added and removed components in 97 SR1. Then they installed Office 2000. Well, it's a lot of work to recreate that state. And I also feel that we don't have enough data about what the most typical states are, because that's huge. But I think that we could do better there. We could do a better job of creating a method for testers' machines to look more real-world-like as they test the product. Now, that doesn't contradict the need to get the product stable first in a more pure environment. But before we ship the product, we have to have more real-world exposure. Our beta cycles, invariably, though they give us a lot of bugs, most of the bugs, as I said earlier, we know about. And I think sometimes we oversubscribe what we think the value add is that our beta sites provide us. And we think, well, that'll probably get exposed, that particular configuration, in beta testing. And often that doesn't happen. And you can see some of that in the bugs that we're fixing in our service releases. And cross-team test liability. This is, again, the issue where after we ship, we used to say, well, if NT changes something or if Visual Studio changes something, especially if it's a shared file we worry about, they need to keep us working. Well, that's just really not possible. Even though we have a great deal more automation and better automation tools, that's just a huge challenge for us. And exporting that test collateral to other teams and having them run it, as I said, is difficult at best. For example, with NT right now, they do run our build verification tests on a regular basis, but they don't run much more than that, and that just covers a little bit of the product. So questions? I hope that gives you some sense of what testing's challenges are. Uh-huh.
So generally, most of the bugs that are in, say, Office 2000, it's like where they came about.
We're actually doing that for the first time seriously. That started about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And, of course, one of the first challenges we faced is we're going to have to come up with a taxonomy by which to categorize these bugs. It's about 450 some odd bugs that we're looking at that are going into the service release. And it actually means going back into RAID for every one of those bugs. And where it's possible, looking at any of the triage decisions we made to determine how to categorize that bug and find out what caused it. So we are doing that quite seriously for the first time for Office SR1. And one of the test managers in Office is working on that, leading that effort.
One of the interesting statistics I heard is that in Office you have more bugs reported to you than you know what to do with. In terms of development actually fixes that. Is that true for Symantec? You've been investing in?
I don't think we have more bugs than we know what to do with. There may be certain spikes where a particular developer may get overwhelmed. One of the things that we look at regularly is what the ratio is of bugs to be regressed that are owned by testers and bugs to be fixed that are owned by developers, so that the test and development managers can see pretty clearly. And that's relatively public info because it's a ratio and it's in the RAID database if you wanted to look at it anyway. But we actually produce reports in this. So we can figure out who needs help. That doesn't mean that every tester or developer is at all interchangeable with other areas. But where it's possible, we can go in and perhaps help that developer or tester get caught up with their fixes or with their regressions. But no, I don't think that we have more bugs than we know what to do with, although a frustrated test manager or two might go around saying that during ship mode. But generally, I think we manage that, and certainly there is a spike to that discovery curve when it gets pretty frantic.
So when you've done triage and determined that there is a bug that's going to have to wait, you're not going to fix it before a current release, how does that get folded into the next release cycle?
We go through another triage, and so after we created, and this is true for every Office release, after we create the new database, in this case the Office 10 RAID database, then the program managers, developers, and testers for every area go back and decide what bugs to port. So there's a second wave of triage. Now, the downside a little bit is that the product hasn't been out enough to have any good data about that decision. But generally, within the set of bugs that are postponed from a given release, people have some very clear recollection of the bugs they feel worst about. So that's the first maybe 15% that's easy to just get moved over because you remember, we got to fix this. And often what makes that triage decision such is that the bug is very low likelihood of getting discovered by a user, and we know that the risk of the fix is going to require having a complete test cycle. And when you're late in the game, you don't have that complete test cycle at your disposal. And so maybe that 10 or 15% it gets moved over very quickly. Then they go back and they look through the next wave of bugs and make a decision that's not so much oriented towards what the developer's load is going forward, but based on really the nature of the bug. But again, the only drawback to that process, and it probably takes us maybe 5 or 6 weeks to complete this across all teams, the drawback to that is that in this case, Office 2000 hasn't been out long enough to give us any more context. So we're kind of re-triaging with the same data that we had in our heads as when we were trying to ship the product.
But when do they get fixed? They get fixed alongside the bug review?
Yes, right. So it becomes part of that developer's next plate of stuff to deal with in the next release. Oh, excuse me, and one other dimension too. For our service release, for example, in SR1, not only are 99.9% of the hot fixes going into the next service release that we've produced as QFEs, but we also go back and do another pass at those bugs we really feel bad about. How many of those could we, with reasonable risk, fix in the service release? So that's another opportunity for those bugs to get addressed.
Say a little bit more about how you're using coverage technology and what set of tests and such for test bugs.
Sure. We've got time. This is at least a 5-minute answer. So, in the past, we weren't doing a very consistent job of code coverage analysis for lots of reasons, not the least of which it was hard. And today we have a goal of roughly 65% code coverage in each application or shared component. Some people do a little under that, a couple of groups significantly under that in Office 2000, and some groups over that. I established that goal because generally you find that maybe 10% of the code base is dead code that hasn't been house kept and removed for whatever reason. And maybe another 5 or 10% of the code might be error code that requires so much alignment of the planets to get into that error state that it is not worthwhile to try to create an automation scenario to hit those particular functions. And then you have, let's say that you're Word and you have 65% code coverage. Then you have another chunk that is either new code being introduced in that release or legacy code that you never got to. And for me, the most important discussion between the developer and tester is not did we reach 63%, just this month. Woohoo, that's great. It's, are you having an active discussion about the code that's not being covered today and actually assessing if you're hitting the right 65%, and of the code that's not getting covered, prioritizing that and coming up with a plan to get automated tests created to increase your code coverage. One of the ways that we assess code coverage today, besides the developer and tester sitting down and looking at all the functions not getting hit today, is we take a Lego-enabled build and we run all of our tests against it and generate the IDFs. And we then have tools we've written to suck the information out of the IDF and produce a report on both a function level as well as a core binary level, like winword.exe, MSO, the MSO DLL, etc. And that's produced on right now we're not producing on a super regular basis, but relatively regular basis. And as more things in the build pipe stabilize, it generally comes out like weekly.
What kind of data are you getting out of that? Is this just coverage data? Is this blocks?
This is blocks and functions getting hit by the auto tests that you have to dig down to the next layer of the report to find out then is it somebody else's auto test that produced this coverage in WinWord, or was it somebody from the Word test team, right? So you actually have to go back and look at, what actually caused that coverage to happen.
65%.
Pardon? Sure, if you send me a piece of mail, I'd be happy to send you the raw data. And then there's an Excel summary that we kind of send broadly.
The 65% is from automation?
Yes.
Not including your manual edit.
No. Now, in some cases, some teams will say, okay, for this run, we also want to have everybody sit down and go through their, it used to be TCM, and now we've moved to Test Studio cases, and see how much coverage we're getting when you execute all the manual cases as well. And teams will do that on a team-by-team basis as they're curious about kind of where they stand in the product cycle.
What fraction of the bugs in a product cycle are discovered through automated tests versus other methods?
When it comes to the check and test and BVTs, a lot. When it comes to our auto tests in general, I don't know the answer to that, but I could easily get it. One measure of that is that, today I think we range anywhere from, 29% to maybe 68% pass rate on all of our auto tests run against current Office 10 builds. And the goal is to get all of those to a passing state as soon as you can, as early as you can. But of all of the total bugs found in the product cycle for one component, how many of those were first discovered based on an auto test failure, I don't know, but we could figure that out. Sorry.
You were talking about 65% coverage, but you know what the coverage would be at the line level? Or is it a function of block level?
Yeah, no, we do not know line level coverage.
So it could be a lot less.
It could be a lot less, that's correct. That's correct. Yes?
So of the bugs that are found after the product ships, the bugs that were never discovered during the test cycle, do you have any idea how many of these bugs are such where if your testers using the same mechanism they use now just had more time they would have found, versus bugs that are found because they were just very subtle and the current process is just not good enough?
Or required a configuration that we didn't quite have or whatever. And you're asking if we understand
what the ratio of those is?
How
many bugs
no.
do you find out about data where you say, if I had a few more testers for a few more days, we would have found it?
I think you could say that about many of the configuration-dependent bugs. And it wouldn't be just maybe more testers, it would be more machines and maybe more automation. Some of the bugs we found have been unique to the combinations of having a localized version of Office and the English version of Office and the advent of this new LPK SKU. So here's a case where we introduced a new SKU, and understandably we've seen some bugs in the post-ship bug traffic there. Don't know what the ratio is, though. The standard now, including it differs, but the standard used to be 2 machines, and now it's 3 machines. But then we also have... I think it's a pretty reasonable number because people have multiple boot partitions on a given machine. And we also have invested in a lot of walk-up machines. So when people are interested in a particular config, there's something sitting around waiting, and it's usually scheduled to be used in a lab where they could just walk up and try something. Yes?
You mentioned the 1-to-1 ratio of developers per tester. Do you see a trend that we might need more testers per developer?
Oh boy, how to answer this? Yes. But it depends on for what. Some groups have been successful with outsourced testing. My experience has been that that's a pretty hard proposition because the test collateral isn't really a canned item. It's something that requires the area expertise of the person that wrote that automation, who knows those tools, to not only execute it successfully, but also do the right interpretation of the results. And often what I've seen is that with outsourced efforts, depending on the scope of testing that's being asked of the outsourced team, a great deal of time then gets spent by the home team on helping them interpret results and determine false positives or false failures versus not. So I know that there has been some discussion of things that we could do to help with that maybe are at a company-wide level to provide a resource that would help with some of the configuration coverage. And again, this is the one area where I would say yes to your question about beyond 1-to-1.
What exactly are you looking for as when you mentioned performance issues, so it takes overnight to find that. How do you find faults? What sort of faults are you looking for? And things like undesirable behaviors that are perfectly legal, are those considered bugs?
They are. And I think by that latter category, you mean something that I would call a usability bug or a discoverability bug. They're absolutely considered bugs. And in fact, those are some of the toughest ones because the earlier you find them, the higher propensity to fix them. When they're discovered late, often the underlying nature of changing it is such that it introduces more risk than potential benefit. And it also requires a set of people to get in a room and form a consensus about whether it's a bug or not. So you end up putting a command on a menu that is either poorly worded, and some of our error dialogues are like this too. You just look at the text and you go, what did this just tell me? And the tester says there's nobody who's going to understand what to do next when they see this dialogue, because it's either a poor use of English or whatever the language happens to be, and or the point in time that it comes up is just not connected with what the user might realize is going on, and nothing in the dialogue suggests what to do next, right? And so bugs like that, just like being able to find where new features are on the menus, etc., absolutely are not, faults, crash, halt, hang, etc. But they are bugs, and we do treat those very seriously. It's just that fixing them and how to fix them is less obvious, so they're more laborious, because you got to get a bunch of people together who, the program manager might have a vision of how somebody will see that feature, and the tester says, there's no way anybody's going to understand this, and they have got to come to a consensus before they can give the developer an idea of what to do.
Let's suppose a team finds a consensus, comes to a consensus that some global sort of idea is bad. Will the developers then alter what's particularly not their code as a single thing? Like, there are some complete modal dialogue boxes are bad.
But not to editorialize, right?
Let's suppose this group decided that something was bad. Would there actually be a development-wide effort to try and root out that kind of?
Yes. One of the things that we undertook in Office, for example, even more globally than you're painting a picture of, is something that a couple program managers came up with called the lame alert. So that for every dialogue, you have every one of those dialogues you don't like, you have yes, no, lame. And lame takes you to a website where you can register your grievance about this dialogue as a developer, tester, program manager. And we've collected a lot of really good data from that. I think people are getting to the point now where they're just clicking past the lame, but it was really popular at first and got a lot of good data about this dialogue doesn't tell me what to do. I think that will help. It doesn't really address the issue you're talking about, but that's one of the methods that we came up with to get better data on what to do and to build consensus about it. Yeah, this is not something we're going to be putting in the product per se. Whether that ends up appearing in a beta release or not is a different matter. But yes, you're right. Right, we're not always our best test case. Yes.
Can you say something about testing the non-code portions of the product, like documentation, for example, within the product?
Well, of course, we have a dedicated user assistance team who authors the help topics. But there are also test engineers in each group who are responsible for testing the UA content for their area. So that content does get tested. It doesn't get tested in this localized form because it would require you speak the language, but it does get tested in its native English form. And with the advent of Office 2000, of course, we had a whole new HTML help engine, and that was a whole new thing to do and work through, and a different way of testing was required there. And that's not the only example. I mean, there's other aspects that are not directly feature function related that testing does own to. And in some cases, program management footprint of the installed image and what's acceptable or not, and what files are in or out on the standard install, things like that. Yes? There's some stuff that I think works great, and there's some stuff that we're working to improve. The stuff that works great is that every product team has a PSS liaison, an individual contributor from the product support team who sits in the building and works with us throughout the entire product cycle. These folks are critical for feedback and issue resolution during the post-ship state, such as now we're working to get SR1 out and helping work through some issues there. And they're also critical when we go to beta test the product that we're working on, such as Office 10. And that communication and that group of people as a team work really well together. They're an especially useful resource for doing two things. When we have our technical betas, we do online chats with our core friend and family sites with whom we have real live connection outside our four walls here. And they are also the people that then go back and train the rest of product support when we get to the ship state on the new feature set, things to be concerned about, how to interpret certain behaviors in the product, etc. Now, there's some things that don't work very well, and that is that today, and some steps are being taken to improve this. The way that PSS gives us data back about the ongoing product in a measurable, web-like way, actually independent of the form of it, but currently they use an internet site for this, is not very good, and reflects kind of their process for collecting the data, but it doesn't necessarily give it to us in a way that we can easily absorb it and then take action on it. But steps are being taken to make that a lot better. And so I'm confident that'll all be in place by the time we get to the beta cycle for Office 10. Blue. Well, I guess the answer is yes. There's a couple things that come to note for me, but I'm going to have a test-specific bent on that answer. One is a tool we have called Office Web Check-In, whose acronym is OWCH, which spells ouch, and I always thought that was pretty interesting. In any case, not all teams are using this, but it's a far richer form of check-in mail and has support in there for generating what's called a TRD, a testing release document. For the teams that are using this today, and FrontPage in particular has kind of spearheaded this effort, when a tester sees check-in mail, it's far richer than it used to be. You not only know exactly what was changed and what is getting checked in, but the developer actually takes the time to say, and this is specifically what I want you to look at once you see this, so the tester doesn't have to try to interpret that on his own or guess, worse yet, on his own. So that, I think, has been real helpful for the teams that are using that. Another thing that we're doing in the product this time is what we call DW, and there's some tools around this which do better crash recovery of Office, but also some pretty extensive capturing of crash state information. And this will actually be a feature in the product, but it's already going to help us in the test cycle for getting the product out the door. And I'd be happy to point anybody to a spec on that. Eric Levine is the program manager for it. And that is really one of those neat features that is useful on multiple fronts. And development is, and a few key developers are absolutely behind this, came up with the idea, championed it, and that was a really neat breakthrough. So those are just two that come to mind.
Speaking of not including this in the beginning, GPS testing is difficult and people don't seem too interested in it.
Well, I think people are interested in it. I just don't think we have a very well coordinated effort across the company, because this is one of those things that has an absolute standard. There's no interpretation by Visual Studio or Office or NT or Exchange. There can't be. It's a moving target. We've had bugs in the past where the border in data map on a particular nation was here one week, but then that government said it was somewhere else the next week, right? So there's only so much we can control. But my point is that I think that we are not doing as much as we could to pull that together. And when you're talking about a product cycle, it's like a spec. You have to say we're going to shoot to have it stable by this point so we know what the test target is, because it can't be an ongoing target, right? And there's some work being done to make that better.
As we become more and more of a global company and more, as you get more computers in other countries, it's going to get bigger economy.
Yes. Right.
So, what are you doing? How are you moving toward that?
A couple of things. Yeah. Very subtle things. In fact, a couple of the clip art things, I don't know how somebody would have caught those. I mean, what proactive structured test approach might have covered that? I mean, I thought it was easy back when User Assistance, and we first did the Answer Wizard, had this list that would make anybody blush of terms that shouldn't be parsed, right? So you didn't want to get the wrong hits. That's relatively easy compared to some of the much more subtle things that we have to try to attack today. One of the things that we've done in Office is that we have now a full-time test lead, and her job is our international test lead. And as such, there's a test lead in another group who kind of coordinates the German effort, which we use not only to ship the product, but it's kind of a guinea pig for our international sufficiency and localization efforts, and the Japanese product. Of course, these two markets are the most important after U.S. But her full-time role is to drive this stuff. And in past releases, this was something that a test lead would take on who had particular leadership skills, but they also had a feature team to manage and features to get done. And so we've recognized that this really is a full-time responsibility. And so for Office 10, this individual, I think, is going to work very closely on the global political sensitivity stuff and make sure that we can get the right thing out of that team spearheaded in time for Office 10 and make sure that all the Office 10 teams are testing towards the same objective there. But it's not easy. That's a particularly tough one, especially when we're not in control of the spec, right? Not really. We, Microsoft, right? Yeah. Anything else? Okay, great. Feel free to holler with questions. Thanks.